Asalaamu Alaikum, and greetings of peace. My name is Safir Ahmed, and it is my distinct honor to welcome all of you in this room and many of you who are watching us on through the magic of live stream to this special evening. What makes this evening special is it's the kickoff of our first fall lecture series. And it's a special evening also because of the topic and because of the speaker we have tonight. So on behalf of the Zaytuna College Board of Trustees, the faculty, the staff, and the students, I want to welcome all of you here. And the format for tonight's program is basically, I will introduce a speaker. There will be a talk. And following the talk, we welcome you to ask any questions. For those in the audience, there's a microphone here. For those on live stream, can send in your questions, and they'll be asked of the speaker as well. So they will try and reserve some time for Q&A at the end of the program. The title of tonight's talk is The Immigration Crisis, the Collapse of the Post-Colonial State. And I think this is a topic worth paying some attention to. As we all know, the immigration crisis is going on, and it's related to the racial crisis, of course. And part of the problem we face in today's world is that we tend to look at problems as if they just happened overnight. These things don't happen overnight. These things have roots that go far back, and they have roots in systems of government, and as our speaker will talk about tonight, they have roots in the post-colonial world, and it's a legacy of colonialism in general. So it behooves us all to understand where these problems come from if we're actually going to tackle and push back and face these problems and these crises. And I cannot think of a better person to help us understand the issues of race, of immigration, of post-colonialism, and Islamophobia, Islam itself, than our speaker tonight. And I want to first give a little small commercial plug for his book, because part of his talk tonight is based on some chapters and sections from his book. And this book is out, it's available at our bookstore. It can be ordered online, and it can be purchased tonight. And I'm sure for those of you in the audience, if you purchase it, Dr. Hatem will be glad to sign the copies of the book. The title of the book is Annotations on Race, Colonialism, Islamophobia, Islam, and Palestine. Let me briefly give you a quick introduction of our speaker. It won't take long. Most of you know him or are familiar with him. Dr. Hatem Bazian is, first of all, he's a provost, co-founder, and a professor at Zaytuna College. He's also a teaching professor in the Department of Near Eastern and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Bazian is an advisor to the Religion, Politics, and Globalization Center at UC Berkeley. In 2009, long before people were even discussing some of these issues, he founded the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley. And he currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Islamophobia Studies Journal and as founder and director of the International Islamophobia Studies Consortium. Dr. Bazian is also on the board of several organizations, including the Islamic Scholarship Fund, the Muslim Legal Fund of America, and the Muslim Americans for Palestine, for which he's, of course, the founding president. These are all issues close to his heart, and I trust that he'll give an enlightening talk, and you'll be able to ask him questions after the talk. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Hatem Bazian.
First, Asalaamu Alaikum. And welcome for friends, colleagues, and thanks, Safir, for the introduction. And welcome to our first lecture in the fall series. So hopefully, for those who are coming here for the first time, there are 8 other lectures, and I know that you came to the first one, but hopefully you will attend and participate in the lectures that are coming. And we have the poster outside for you to identify and see all the lectures that are taking place. Now, why, as a Muslim, why to engage in the discussion about immigration? That's a question, like what is it, especially at this particular time? What is really what are the motivations, and why should we be concerned about the issue of immigration, and to frame it as the crisis, and then also to put it in a larger context on the post-colonial. And I think one, from an Islamic perspective, if not all of the prophets that are mentioned in the Islamic tradition, all were immigrants. So if we think about the narrative of Abraham, Abraham is an immigrant. We actually say as Palestinians, we gave him his green card in Palestine because he came out of Iraq, Mesopotamia, and came to Palestine, lived among the Canaanites. The prophet Joseph was also an immigrant back and forth, not only an immigrant, but also in essence was a slave because he was sold into slavery, was a political prisoner, if you want to use that terminology. If we think of Moses as also an immigrant, and some that actually will say that Jesus himself had to seek refuge, and therefore he was also a form of immigrant and a refugee. More importantly, the Prophet himself, Prophet Muhammad, is an immigrant. He actually immigrated from the city of Mecca to Medina, and that is the foundation of Islamic calendar. The Islamic calendar actually is called by the term Hijri, literally the immigration or the point of immigration. So Islamic history is actually marked by the migration of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina, not by his birth, not by the point of claiming power, but rather that event of migration. And then the early community in Islamic history is called actually the immigrants and the helpers, al-Muhajirin and al-Ansar, the immigrants and the helpers, and both are highly praised in the Quran at the foundation because they sacrificed to create one community in Medina. So in this sense, there is enough epistemic calling for, as a Muslim, to engage in the discussion about immigration. So just to have some few definitions to begin with, when we say immigration, or an immigrant is a person who comes to a country to take a permanent residency, even though they might come back and forth. So again, in the United States, at least as far as I know in this room, all of us are immigrant, with the exception of Native Americans. So unless you're a Native American, then you are native. Everyone else is basically an immigrant. Some have arrived here earlier, at a time where they did not have to go through an immigration checkpoint, because Native Americans did not have an immigration office at the time. So in essence, if you are not Native American, then you are just an immigrant in this country, few generations removed. The other term is colonialism, and I think it's a very important term for us to understand and relate to. Colonialism is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country or territory, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. And when we speak about colonialism, there are two different types of colonialism. Colonialism with a mother colonial power that sends some of its settlers to use the resources, to extract the resources to the motherland, and then settler colonialism, where the settlers take over the country and they push out the native indigenous populations, either by transfer, or the most successful type is through genocide. And therefore, in the United States, we could say that we have the most successful settler colonial project because the native population was put to genocide, and that's the type of settler colonialism also we witnessed in South Africa, in Australia, and places where the settlers took over the land, in distinction to colonialism, like the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Dutch, where they had the colonial motherland, extracting the resources and having some settlers, but they're really the populations for the most part remained in there. Now, if we have colonialism, then what is post-colonialism? Because again, the title is dealing with post-colonialism. And post-colonialism is the political or cultural conditions of a former colony, as well as a theoretical approach in various disciplines that is concerned with the lasting impact of colonization in the former colonies. So post-colonialism, again, looks at those countries and states that have experienced colonialism, what type of political structure that is there, what type of economy, what is type of social norms that are still connected to the colonial legacy. Now, there are definitely a strand that speaks of post-colonial literature. So for those who look at post-examination and critique of post-colonial literature, so there is that avenue as well. But it's a discipline that looks at post-colonial period. Now, when we think about the current crisis, there's approximately 65 million immigrants and refugees around the world today that are on the move. So in essence, if you think about the number, 65 million, plus or minus, depending also on what definitions you speak, the largest two groups of those, again, are the Afghan immigrant/refugee population. And then the second, again, is the Syrian immigrant refugee population that right now, both internally and externally, almost half of the population currently is an immigrant refugee. And then the third is the Palestinian immigrant refugee population that also from 1948 onward. Now, I left aside something that I will be speaking later, is that there are also a large number of, again, involuntary immigrants, which is also, using the term is somewhat intellectually insulting, because African Americans are called often in the literature involuntary immigrants, which is correct in the first one, involuntary, but definitely the second is not, because they were brought as property, and therefore the involuntary nature is correct. And again, we see about 40 million plus, maybe 42 to 45 million, and this is a large population that has been displaced from Africa and currently in the United States, but other places. Now, why do I want to examine the immigration crisis from the collapse of the post-colonial state? Much of the literature on immigration focuses on the problem of yesterday, meaning that it occurred yesterday. It's just there's a few Syrians that crossed the Mediterranean and now we have a problem, right? Or that there's some Mexicans that are standing on the border and there we have a problem in there. So it's actually very limited, narrow construction, and begins to actually shape the discourse about immigration in a very rudimentary and not highly sophisticated overall to look at what is taking place. So for me, the immigration crisis is a much more of a 400 to 500 year process that we are currently seeing some of its net effects in this massive movement that is taking place around the world. So to begin with, we need to think of the colonial period. The colonial period begins around the 15th century. And one of the, again, the 15th century, we see the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain. And therefore, within European discourse, especially the Spanish crown, turns first on its internal other and expels Muslims and Jews in order to create or to begin the process of the modern world that we are experiencing. On the back of this massive movement, involuntary movement out, we get Columbus sailing the sea, right, and being lost on his way to India, and the Native Americans discovering that he was lost. And in essence, that begins and reshapes the new process that ends up with genocide of the native population and then the introduction of African slaves into the New World. Now, in relations to the introduction of the African slave and slavery, we're talking from a low of 10 to 12 million to possibly a high of 30 million individuals that are taken from Africa and brought to the New World. So if we speak about development in Africa today, we are not accounting that generation after generation, the best and the brightest and the most able bodies were taken out from that territory. And then on top of that, we followed a direct colonial project in the region that continued to disrupt the development and the process of normative societal processes, whether economic, political, and so on. So that gets us into one of the massive mobilization or massive movement of humans across borders. And this is not also to look at the pre-modern period, but in essence, in the modern period, a law of 12 million to 30 million people that were forced into slavery and brought to the United States, that begins to disrupt the normative practices that exist in Africa. So the massive waves are not of today, but rather they are of an earlier period and continue to build upon in the modern society. Now, moving from the slave period to the direct colonialism of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. Many of us take it for granted that if you came to any part of the world in the beginning of the 20th century, 75% of the Earth's surface was a colonial possession of one colonial power or the other. All right, so again, you enter into the 20th century, 75% of the land surface of the world was a colonial possession, either for the French, the British, the Dutch, the possibly remnant of the Spanish and Portuguese, the Germans. So what we're dealing is with a massive colonial footprint. Africa as a whole, from north to south, east to west, with an exception of Ethiopia, was a total colony that was a colonial possession, which meant the affairs of the society was totally dominated by external powers. Now, this process of colonization was directly connected to economics. So that's why we speak of the East India Company, which not only engaged in extracting resources, but was vested at the hub of politics in the global north or in Europe. And also almost every European power had a company or a set of companies, especially Great Britain, France, and the Dutch and the Spanish had many companies that were engaged in this colonial extraction and colonial process that continued to dominate these societies. Now, when we speak about the colonial process, we have to speak about the mechanics of it, right? Because it's not enough to say that the European powers came, the Great Britain came, they took the resources and left, and now we're dealing with post-coloniality. We're missing a lot of steps that I wanted to fill in there. Now, first is that the colonial structure was vested in training colonial elites in the colonies, meaning the colonial subjects were trained to manage the colonies. And that's why, for example, in India, the British did not have a large troops. So what they did is they instrumentalized. They recruited elites in these societies, educated them in a colonial worldview in order, in essence, to manage the colonies on behalf of the British or the French or others. So that was a process of transforming the epistemic and the worldview of these societies in order to become essentially seeing themselves in the eyes or in the sight of the colonial power. Not only that, but these colonial elites that were trained also were moved from one colony to the other in order to become the middle man or middle people. Example, in South Africa, there was the category of blacks. There was the category of the colored, and then there were the category of the British and the Dutch as the colonial settlers that came to South Africa. The colored population were predominantly brought in from other colonies, the British or the Dutch, in order to act as the middle people, and therefore they set up themselves in a hierarchical way on a racial structure to be above the blacks, but definitely below the Dutch and the British. In this sense, they actually created a racial hierarchy, not only in the colonial territory in India or other places, but also moved them around to the different colonial possession in order to become the middleman in that process. Now, the post-colonial picture was actually founded upon these elites, because many of these elites in the post-colonial became the managers of the so-called independent states. Often, the post-colonial people got trapping in the stamp, the flag, the honorary guards, all the trappings of independence, but they never thought about the economy, the structure of who is controlling the economic underpinning. Even today in South Africa, there is massive upheaval in South Africa, specifically in relations to who is controlling the economic assets, resources, and who still is benefiting from it, because that shift has not occurred. Yes, in 1992, the end of direct colonization in Africa ended with the arrival or the undermining of apartheid, but the economic underpinning in South Africa is still being held by those powers and those forces that have really benefited and controlled the economy in South Africa. So the elites in the colonies were trained to manage the colonies, to see themselves superior against or toward their own population, and to strive to imitate the colonial power of the colonial master. And in this sense, creating a particular person who's what you call is in no man land. They don't belong to their own society, and at the same time, they don't belong to the colonial motherland. In essence, they inhabit a place of lack of meaning. Furthermore, they are not connected to any of their own traditional learning or societies, and as such, they have developed an antagonism relative to their own societies and whatever history, culture, tradition that existed in there. Definitely, we see this in relations to the Muslim society. Many of the Muslim societies actually are trained, in essence, to be in the colonial manager space, and as such, they were alienated from their own tradition, and therefore what you find is their ability to read and navigate that tradition is very rudimentary at best, and whatever they actually read and acquainted themselves was translated to them or was accepted as part of the management of the native subject. So that creates this alienation that exists and is present there. More to this colonial elites, this opens the door for the brain drain from the global south, from the colonies to the global north. And that door has not closed. It began by bringing these colonial subjects to be middle managers, but in due time, all of the elites was connected directly to this migration, and that migration for education have not stopped. So if you look at elites in the global south, all of them, with almost very limited exception, have been trained in the global north as managers of the post-colonial economic order. And what do you learn in the global north is basically the same economic foundation that is pernicious, that is adversarial, that again continues to maintain the structure or the order as it is. So that brain drain continues to be the primary feature of this transformation. And yes, there are some who make it to the global north and become critics of the system, but the bulk and the overwhelming majority actually maintains itself and functions in that middle manager type of relationship in every economic aspect of it. So on top of the colonial elites, now we get into the 20th century. And I think the 20th century needs to be understood in relations to immigration, not only as a result of World War I, World War II, but to begin with World War I. World War I saw massive movement of colonial subjects to fight the wars on the front line of both the French and the British and the European powers. So if you go to Britain and you go to France, you'll find there is in the Army Museum and also in the museums, there's a 100-year anniversary of First World War. And in one section, you see all the colonial troops. You'll see Lebanese troops, you see Algerian troops, you see actually Sikh troops with turbans, you see Indian troops. All of these were actually frontline troops in both the French and the British and the colonial powers that fought World War I. But what is important is the movement of these colonial subjects into the heart of the colonial motherland. In addition, during that period and before that period is also bringing labor, cheap labor, and unskilled labor to do many of unskilled work in the colonial heartland. So what began with the elite, bringing them for education, opened the door for this massive importation of cheap labor in order to function and do all type of work in the colonial motherland, and intentionally was to recruit people without education, is to recruit people without actually know-how, and to recruit from the countryside because they're docile, they're easily to be controlled, and they don't have, quote, the sophistication in order for them to challenge the structures that are there. So if you go to look at the suburbs in France, in suburbs of Paris, if you go to Belgium, if you go to the UK, you'll find some of these individuals that are brought in to do these functions, and they continue second, third generation without investment into transformation, which usually in a normative immigration structure, individuals actually by the third generation, they'll have a normative development and a normative existence within the broader society, but not in the situation where these colonial subjects were brought in and kept at the margin in order to maintain the functions that were brought in the first place. And often it's also not correct to compare the United States with Europe in relation to immigration. The process of immigration, the arrival is completely different, especially in relations to Muslims, but also in relations to other society as well. So the First World War, the Second World War witnessed massive destabilization and movement of population from the colonial territories and also entering into the post-colonial period itself. Now, the post-colonial period, beginning, again, post-Second World War to the present, there are critical demarcation that also brings about a massive shock to the global South. Because, again, why people are moving, no human being moves from their country if their country is, in essence, provide them all their needs and they don't have a sense of insecurity. So what are the things that are happening or happen at least in the past accelerating in the past 70 to 80 years, and this we get into the Cold War. First, during the Cold War, there was an instrumentalization and repackaging the same type of rivalries in the global South and instrumentalizing religious tension, ethnic tension, racial tension, class differentiation in order to rally and mobilize the various communities to be engaged in various parts of the Cold War. I don't even like to use the term Cold War because it implies that the people were sitting in there and drinking drinks that have some ice in it. And for the global North, it was basically conferences and people arguing about detente and not detente, the Iron Curtain and so on. But in the global South, there was nothing that was cold about it. It was hot. It was intensely hot and intensely violent. And we had, again, massive death that was caused by the Cold War. Just if you think about the war in Angola, in Zaire, the wars in Zimbabwe, the wars in Latin America, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Chile, Guatemala. If you go to Asia, in terms of Vietnam, which is at the hub of the Cold War, Laos, Cambodia. You think about the overthrow of the Shah, of the Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran. You think about all these were part of the Cold War. Every one of these resulted in a mass movement of people, forcefully so, as a result of the conditions or the competition between the major powers. I use the example of the Vietnamese community, all right, just to go away from what we consider to be the norm in relations to Muslims. If you were in the Bay Area in the 1960s, there wasn't any Vietnamese community in the Bay Area. There wasn't any Vietnamese restaurants. It is only post-US intervention in Vietnam, which was as a result of attempting to help the French, right, who were the colonial powers in there, that the United States entered into the Vietnam War. And as a result of the intervention in Vietnam and the war, we ended up having Vietnamese that came as a result of the end of the Vietnam War. And now we have large Vietnamese communities in the Bay Area and other places in the United States, so much so that in San Jose, you had two Vietnamese that actually ran against each other for the city council election. That phenomena is directly related to the Cold War and directly related to US intervention in there, that we have actually a Vietnamese community. This is not to speak about the politics or what type of politics, that's setting aside, but just to think that immigration and refugee is directly related to the Cold War. In the same way, today we have Afghan population. One of the largest Afghan population outside of the borders of Afghanistan is actually in the Bay Area. If you go to Newark, Fremont, Hayward, some parts of Concord, highest concentration of Afghan population. I studied the Bay Area, about 20% of the Muslims in the Bay Area are of Afghan background. That was direct result of US policy to try to punish the Soviet Union for the Soviet Union bloodying the US face in Vietnam, and therefore the Afghan population basically were the foot soldiers and the cannon fodder for a Cold War foreign policy that resulted in this massive movement of Afghan. This door continues to this present day. The Afghan population is still escaping a death and destruction from, literally, they've been at war since 1977. And now they experience the Russian invasion. Then we have the US invasion, and now we're still escalating. We just sent another group of soldiers and army in there. So essentially, the Cold War is directly connected to the presence of Afghan population in the United States, but also in Turkey, as well as in Germany. So anyone who studies the movement of Afghan refugees and migrants, they actually emerge out of Afghanistan either through Iran and Pakistan, then they pass through Turkey, then they go through Germany, and then they arrive to the United States. So often they actually go through 2 or 3 stops before they arrive to the United States, and they allowing the Afghans to enter into the United States was directly a policy, a government policy due to foreign policy considerations. So in essence, when we think about the status of refugee and also immigration policy is directly connected to foreign policy consideration, and we see this specifically in relations to the Cold War. So the Cold War was a process that built upon the colonial period in the post-colonial period and caused a massive destabilization and massive movement of population. During the Cold War, also we have another major event as well, which is the 1973 oil crisis. That is, the oil crisis, aside from the Palestine-Israel conflict, what it created is a massive economic shock in the post-colonial state. And all of a sudden, many of these post-colonial states that was just emerging from their from their colonial period were beginning to set up some level of independence, were immediately shocked by the oil crisis. But on top of the oil crisis is that we have massive resources that came to our banking industry and European banking industry. Now, for those who took my economic class, how do banks make money? How do banks make money? How do banks make money? When you deposit your money in the bank actually considers it a liability. So they have to immediately find another victim to take the money that you put to loan it to them. And we know from the economic crisis that they were loaning this many, many times over, right? And now they only have to keep a certain percentage of liquidity in the bank. So the banking industry on a global level received all these massive deposits from the oil crisis and immediately sent loan salesmen across the world. And what happened is they loaded the post-colonial states with all types of loans. And at a certain point, they were asking some of the banks, they said, don't you have a problem that you're loaning to countries that don't have the resources to pay back? He said, no, that's somebody else's problem. We're only responsible for selling. And that's why actually they were engaging in loaning and extending these loans, because the sense is that the more you loan and the more that you entangle the global south with loans, the more that you have almost a veto power over their domestic political outlook. So in essence, the loaning structure became another layer that empowered the colonial states of the past to actually leverage that power during the post-colonial period. And when the financial crisis of the loan industry hit into a major block, they came up with a very innovative plan to do so. And this is what's called the IMF and the World Bank. They came up with what's called structural adjustment programs. I call them destructive adjustment programs. The World Bank and the IMF, I also call these two agencies as the bouncers of the global economic system. You know, for you, many of you go to some of these high places where they have a bouncer, two big bodies in there. The IMF and the World Bank, they're not there to help the global South or the states of the South. If you can't pay, they send the IMF and the World Bank. And their role is to extract the payments for the banks or the institution that loaned you in the first place, the loan, knowing that you can't pay. In a similar way, what they do these days with student loans. They know that you can't pay. They know that you're going to give you a credit card and you're going to run immediately and spend every penny on it. And they loan you with another. And then they have, again, a policy where they could begin to deduct from your life. So for the next 30 years or 40 years in your life, you're going to be beholden to a student loan. So in a sense, you're in debt from birth to death, systematically so. So again, that process of the structural adjustment program, and I call them destructive adjustment program, they came up with the plan is, again, which is the most destructive, is that you increase exports of your raw material, reduce social services, reduce expenditure on education, reduce support for prices, in essence, intensifies poverty and rewards the elite that has been set in there to manage. And on top of that, they added what's called equity for debt swap. So if you owe $1 billion, but you have a mine, we'll take the mine as a debt for equity swap. Thus, the post-colonial period saw that actually the countries that were given to these elite trained through the colonial period to turn their assets without having to have the foot soldier in there. In the direct colonial period, you needed to have the troop. You needed them to have them on a ship. You needed to land on a port. You needed to fight all the way until you get the gold mine, and then you begin to extract to send the gold. Now you actually, with a stroke of a pen, in a nice 5-star hotel, and you sign, and therefore you have to sign away the mine, the gold mine, the diamond mine, the cocoa plantations, the natural resources, and that occurred again, accelerated in the 1970s with the oil crisis, providing a large amount of resources to loan some of these countries that are in the global South. So we have a further disruption in the global South and in these colonial states that results in destabilization and movement of population, again, in a much more, because not only that you lost any economic leverage, also the assets that possibly were locally managed, and there were closeness to the market that people were engaged in, is completely disrupted. This gets us into entry into the what's called globalization. And the globalization and privatization that is built upon or post this economic crisis as a result of the oil crisis in 1973. Globalization is a euphemism for, again, another pattern of disrupting global South economic processes. Globalization and privatization engage the elite in such a way that they privatize the major assets of the society. And if you want to understand the impact of privatization, Egypt is a good example of what happened with the privatization strategy, beginning with Sadat, who used the term that what we need is the takhsis, which is privatization. And what happened is elites who were on the take sold the state assets to global North corporations at a very reduced price, because many of these elites were paid on the side deposits or commissions to sell these assets at a lower level. And therefore, few among the elites were able to be paid for selling the massive assets, including land, water system, oil. Now there's a whole project for privatization of a whole set of new oil sectors and so on. And as such, what you have, the privatization dispossessed the state itself of the last remnants of that which was collectively owned. And often these were strategic assets that were present in there. So globalization and privatization created this process. And then on the other element of this globalization privatization is beginning to bring the corporate structure from the global North to set what you call assembly plants. Assembly plants is not development. Sweatshops are not development. Packaging services are not development. What it ends up happening is actually completely demolishing the local economy. If you think of Walmart, the entry of Walmart into neighborhoods and what it does to all of the small stores and moms and pop shops and the local economy, think of Walmart in a global sense being set up across many parts of the global south, whether it's in Indonesia, Malaysia, Egypt, and so on, that begins to actually even curtail the possibility of future development. So again, what we're looking at is this process that begins with the colonial period, continues in the post-colonial period, and it's accelerated in this sense in a massive way. And I didn't even touch into the major wars that are taking place right now, because the massive flow of immigrants and refugees predates this last 3 or 4 years, is actually much more in duration. Lastly, I wanted to actually speak specifically about how one particular group of immigrants and refugees are used to hide the picture. There is a real need of the Syrian refugees and immigrants. There's no question about it. There's massive refugee crisis relative to the Syrians. But in many European countries, as well as the United States, they use the threat of Syrian refugees as a way to close the door and to almost erase the picture and the image of all the refugees. In France, most of the refugees in France are not Syrians. There are about only 10% that are actually of Syrian background. Most of the refugees and immigrants in France comes from the ex-French colonies. And they have been the case throughout the 20th century and has been the case today. But when you put the Syrian image in there, it's both you transform the debate rather than immigration and refugees, colonial responsibility and accountability, demolishment of the economy, it begins that you're dealing with Islamophobia and security. So instead of actually discussing what happened in a 300-year period, now you speak of the threat of somebody with a turban speaking a few words of Arabic, and now the French society is undermined and French civilization itself is undermined by that, and you rally and mobilize the right wing in order to vote to protect the French and the French society, rather than seeing this is essentially a 300 period that continues to have the door open. The end result of what I want to conclude with is that there is no way to stop the immigration problem or crisis unless there is a complete transformation of how we think of immigration and refugees. And instead of thinking of it as a problem on our front door, the problem is, again, is a much longer in duration and has to be a completely rethinking economic relations, political relations, interventionist policies, militarism that is taking place in there. In the same way that we thought post-Second World War of having a Marshall Plan, there has to be a different Marshall Plan that is to be undertaken in relations to areas where this immigration flow is taking place. Meaning that there is no way for us right now to have an economy that benefits us without thinking of an economy that benefits and uplifts everyone in a sustainable, equitable basis. Does that mean that everyone should feel that they're guilty? It's not an individual guilt. It's a collective responsibility for a legacy and history that continues to be with us to the present. Disrupting the economies of the global south, disrupting the local structures, the societies, will result in this massive flow of people that are escaping famine, escaping economic dislocation, escaping war, escaping all types of circumstances that are humanly produced. And as such, I think the challenge for us is to rethink how to address immigration and refugees, and not to actually be susceptible to fear, to demonization, to thinking that building a wall will end the problem. If you build the wall, they'll tunnel under. If you close the tunnels, they'll go sideways. Why? Because again, the conditions that produce the refugees, the immigrants, is still there. And until you deal with those issues that are fundamentally there, then you are only dealing with trying to address the toothache rather than the heart attack that is waiting and continues to be there at every turn. So thank you, and I welcome all your questions.
For anyone in our audience who has a question, please go to the question and answer mic, which is in the front left.
Thanks. This was a great talk. I learned a lot. Appreciate it. So I'm always, in my mind, I'm trying to draw the line between like the intention to subjugate or to colonialize folks versus maybe like a myopic opportunism, you know. And somewhere around your lecture around the 70s, I was trying to piece that together. So I guess I was wondering if you had any examples where you could double click to, or maybe that's not your argument at all. Maybe you're not saying that colonial powers in some sort of nefarious way wanted to, maybe they just were taking advantage. So maybe I'm misunderstanding or not knowing your position, but if that was your position, I would love to know more about how you reached that conclusion.
Well, again, colonial powers had a particular worldview, and they wanted to pursue an agenda that is founded upon a notion of superiority. So again, we're dealing these days with the concept of white supremacy. We have at the early foundation this notion that there is something in there that is superior, and then whether that was initially there and then they mobilized the economic, again, it's a chicken and egg. Did the chicken come first or an egg? That's a debate that is unending. But from that point onward, we see that there is actually, at every turn, a nefarious campaign that is intended, systematic, and also legalized. So even today when we speak about international law is essentially the formalization into code, the benefits and the privileges that were gained during the colonial period. And therefore, how to begin to claim your rights if the law that you appeal to, essentially it is constructed around colonial legalistic discourses. The notion of property, like if anybody studied the United States, the statement, the Native Americans had a different attitude toward property. Excuse me, everybody have a different attitude to property. Does that different attitude gives you the right to actually commit genocide and expel them because you see their property as being much better for whatever purposes that you set yourself for?
What about the idea that was in the United States of the melting pot?
Well, I think that question would be asked for Native Americans, which part of the melting pot they are in.
I'm thinking of the last, say, 200 years, going back 300 or more. That's too long for my memory.
Yeah.
But the United States had a notion that maybe the diversity of immigrants could become regular citizens. Was it a fantasy?
Well, I think, again, it's an ideal, but that ideal, again, if we take Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, if we take his speech from I Have a Dream and then go to his last speeches in 1967-68, he was, again, waking up and saying that the dream is unaccomplishable. The melting pot, again, is an ideal value, but it's definitely been challenged from the first moment. The founding fathers excluded African Americans, excluded women, Chinese. And now, on the societal level, are we moving toward actualizing not melting pot, because that melting pot theory has already moved. There is the concept of mosaic, there's also the salad bowl, all these conceptualization. Can we arrive at a multicultural society that no longer has a racial hierarchy and places one group over the other as a part of the foundation or the attempt to found a society? It's a new experiment, but again, just knowing where the national debate is at, we're definitely challenged at this point to even arrive or attempt to arrive at an understanding of it.
You finished your lecture envisaging a Marshall Plan to make up for the inequalities between the global North and the global South. And I come from Italy, and despite the fact that Marshall Plan helped rebuild my country and definitely had a component of self-interested, it was also a political strategy to buy out influence and against growing communism in Europe. So which kind of Marshall Plan do you envisage, and from who?
Well, again, my idea of a Marshall Plan, using Marshall Plan as a term without being wedded into the specifics, because again, the United States in the Marshall Plan, our economy was performing at a high level. The German economy collapsed, European economies collapsed, so we were producing all these products that needed a market. So there was an incentive to it. So the concept, we need to think about how to reinvest and reconstitute economies that have been collapsed for so many years. We no longer need to push what you call downstream development. So I don't want to see somebody saying, you know, we're going to bring an Apple, what you call assembly plant in our neighborhood because it's going to have 1,000 jobs. Yes, you're going to have 1,000 jobs on this side, but you're going to completely destroy the local economy. So innovation is going to be completely disrupted. You're going to be wedded into the Apple, what you call methodology. So there has to be a rethinking of all those notions relative to what a development means. I'm very critical of the whole conceptualization of development. We teach development, which essentially takes the same assumptions of economic underpinnings and then pushes as development, rather than thinking or going down and say, what are the specific ways that these cultures, these societies have been developing for so long, and what were the disruption? And again, this is a debate. Can we go back to the pre-colonial period to reconstruct, because we have a 250 to 300-year disruption, and in rethinking, there has to be some rethinking and some re-innovation in terms of what needs to take place forward in order to change the dynamics. Today, the global south is subsidizing the global north, right? If you take any criteria in terms of economic underpinning, the global south is sending its resources to the global north, so we're actually living in the global north on the back of the global south, right? And you could look at the net outflow in there. Also, the fact that also militarism, we're benefiting tremendously from militarism. The United States has 55% of the world market in the armament sale. And the primary countries that are buying these sales are, again, in those countries that have massive economic disruption and also where they have natural resources. So the Marshall Plan is not to the specifics, but rather into the idea of what needs to be done. I know some people say we've been sending so much aid to the South. You haven't been sending aid to the South. The United States sends $10 billion of annual aid to the world. Half of it goes to Egypt and Israel, so now that leaves you with about $5 billion out of $10 billion. Is negligible compared to the net outflow of actually capital that comes out of Africa to the United States or to Europe in general. So again, but the country is not ready to discuss this because everybody thinks, how about me? And again, it's been 500 years of about me without thinking how about us, about we, to change the economic picture altogether.
Hi. So I apologize if this is kind of a broad question, and you know, I'm kind of curious. I'm a poli-sci major, so if you give me a microphone, I have to ask a question.
Okay.
But yeah, my basic question is, you talk about globalization, you know, and how it sort of, essentially, it hurts the global South, you know. But my impression, and again, these are just abstractions. I don't fully understand what globalization exactly is. You know what I mean? But my question is basically, can it be reworked? Is it the best strategy with regard to how it used to be? Do you know what I mean? Like, is it better to be globalized, to live in a globalized world, or would it be better to be more
isolationist?
Yeah, I guess economically isolationist.
Again, the type of globalization that has developed for the past 300 to 400 years under the colonial period is a particular type of globalization, which actually direct the resources toward a very small groups and also collapsing, I don't want to use the term traditional, but existing networks, economic networks, existing societies and processes that were developed over the years. The oldest globalization of trade is the Silk Trade Route, which is 3,000 years of cooperative economic underpinning. Today, globalization is not globalization, it's the concentration of pernicious economic behaviors, not subject to, again, we say that our economy is market economy. We're not a market economy. We're a highly regulated economy controlled by a particular set of incentives, incentivizing the corporations and the elites to gain benefits at the expense of everyone else. So we don't have actually a market economy. The market does not determine overall the picture, because if it did, we should not have any of the banks around these days. In 2008, we had an economic collapse, and what happened? They came and said, oh, we're going to be losing the economy, you need to rescue us. So they went to you, me, and everybody in this room and stole from our pocket to rescue a bank that actually conducted themselves in the most irresponsible way, leveraging the economy 70 times, and then they come and say, well, you guys are asking for welfare. No, the banks are asking welfare, and we actually gave them welfare, 775 billion, and then we turned the TARP, in essence, taking money unlimited in this sense. So for me, the globalization has to be challenged in the current period, reconstituting different type of cooperative economic underpinnings, sustainable, and it should not be leveraging the North to the global South. We need to rethink the raw material trade. How many of you in here like chocolate? Right? What is it? French chocolate, Belgium, Swiss. Name the country. Dutch, Swiss, French. Now, all of us love chocolate. Even you go to 7-Eleven, there's Mars Bar, Kit Kat, and all that. How is it that the chocolate, all the chocolate that we eat, comes from the global North, yet all the cocoa leaves are in the global South, and we cannot name a single country in the global South that could actually give us a chocolate? You have people that are actually working in plantation to produce cocoa, yet they have not eaten themselves the chocolate, the Swiss or the French chocolate. You're going to take a picture next to the chocolate and you put it in a museum, while the people that are working from Kansi in the morning to Kansi at night today, that are producing these benefits. So that's what I'm saying about the disruption of the factor. We all have iPhones in our pockets, right? It's not made in Cupertino, right? You have 480 some pieces in the iPhone, right? And it all comes from all types of small manufacturers. And recently they got in trouble because some of the assembly line for Apple is just have horrible conditions. So they went and fixed it by, all kinds of maneuvering to take place. So we have to critique the current global economics and to reorient and change the basis of when we say globalization, what does that mean? And when we say free market, what does that mean? And how these are instruments to continue to actually create the same colonial into the post-colonial and continue the disruption into many of the states that we are witnessing much of the chaos that are there.
Thank you.
I'll take a question
we have
from
online. Go ahead, Harun.
Okay, just a second. Let me cue that back up. So someone asked, I would like to hear about your vision, Dr. Hatem, for the kind of global solidarity work you want to see from us, the subaltern, and our allies as we move towards liberation.
Well, again, I think solidarity begins by first knowing your condition. If you don't know your condition, and we don't know what problems we're dealing with, then it's very difficult to begin the solidarity. Now, knowing the condition, there might be differentiations of the different conditions that we're facing. So not everybody will have the same type of intensifications or the problems that we're facing. So that's important. The third is that we need to begin to create alternative economic patterns and behaviors at the local level. And unless we begin to do those things at the local level, the ability to reshape economics at the global level will be a challenge. Again, the longer the chain supply for your product, the more there is abuse and complete violations of people's rights take place. So if your product, whether clothing or any product that you're using, is coming with a long chain of supply, then you'll have to understand that there is abuse in the whole process, from the employee at the assembly line all the way until it gets to you. So we have to rechange that type of economic behavior at the local level. It's difficult, but again, to reconstitute it in there. Berkeley was the place, again, was to shop local. The concept of a farmer's market is actually born out here down at downtown Berkeley, right? Before people thought about local purchases, farmers market. The concept of organic, 15 years ago, people used to laugh that you're actually eating organic, because again, everybody is like, we have advanced in the green agricultural revolution. If you don't have 10 pesticides in your apple, it's not good, because you need to be shining from the pesticides in your body, all right? So that actually something that you actually saw the change that took place, where people actually work hard in order to arrive to this moment. So we need to actually begin to rethink outside the box right? And unless we begin to think outside the box of the possibilities for both solidarities and economic patterns of behavior and engagement, then we will be stuck still running on the same type of closed view and closed vision. Is that it in the back?
Yes, that was it from online for now. If there's another question up front.
Okay, if you have it.
Thank you for the lecture. Last year I took a class on international development, and basically the whole class was, again, criticizing colonialism and criticizing like the modernization period. And most of the time of the class we focused on Gunther Frank, who was criticizing that. But my question is, since that was quite a long time ago, there were some steps, having learned the mistakes, like there were some steps taken, and how would you assess those steps that have been taken, and how would you probably supposed to differ them?
Well, let's take again, the steps that are taken are problematic in itself. Let's take the garment industry right now. And just let's take Bangladesh, right, which has become the hub of garment industry, sweatshops that have been set up, and now you have buildings that are staffed with massive amount of employees with equipment that are not sustainable for the building, and you have literally building collapsing as a result of this process. Now, under the new attempt to address this is the WTO, the World Trade Organization, created some level to try to create what you call an agreement of how much products that needs to be brought into the market, from which country, garment is one, shoe industry, and so on. So on the one hand, they tried to fix what you call a certain aspect of quota, but what it made, again, because we're not addressing at the foundation, what are the thinking process in terms of these elites that we have been incentivizing over a long period of time. So what you end up is actually massively reconstituting the sweatshop industry in Bangladesh, and now you have a pernicious feeding frenzy because the elite is depending on these contracts in order to bring these merchandise into the market, and they find that they are victorious because all of a sudden they had a whole industry, garment industry set up because of the new agreement of the WTO and these economic planning. So I think the thinking has to be rethinking the whole concept of development. For me, now this is, again, you could take it or you could critique it. Much of the development from the global north comes in with already an accepted paradigm of what the global south needs. And therefore, it actually does not begin the question of what do you think you need yourself in order for you actually to come out of the current process that is there. And often that question, if it is asked, it's asked to elites that are trained in our university. So we go to the person who graduated from Berkeley, from the economics department, and now is sitting what you call as assistant to the assistant of the minister, and we ask him the question. He's going to give us the same answer because he's trained under our system, and therefore there is a meeting of the mind. So that problem has to be disrupted in order for us to rethink development and rethink the process in a much more systematic way, so we don't create the conditions that maybe shifts the paradigm on a certain aspect, but creates problematics in other places within each of the country.
Jazakumullah khairan for the lecture. So my question is, I believe that you said in the lecture that when it comes to immigration, that certain immigrant populations are given preference over others, and this is directly related to foreign policy.
No, I said the choice of immigration decisions of immigration and refugees is susceptible to foreign policy consideration, is not, quote, a humanitarian consideration.
So can you possibly give a few examples of how that is so, or how that has been over the years?
Well, again, I use the example of the Afghan refugees, right? The Reagan administration granting the Afghan refugees the status of refugees was a direct result of the US engagement in wanting to support the Afghan war against the Russians after the Russians' invasion of Afghanistan. So it was not a humanitarian consideration, it was a foreign policy consideration. Right? So that's what I'm saying. Now look at it today in terms of the Syrians. If the humanitarian consideration should be the Syrian refugees should be granted refugee status, period. And now we have what you call, they limited the number, and then they have what you call this intense scrutiny that is there. So it's not really a humanitarian consideration without any other avenues that are contravening the decision on the refugee status. So what I want you to realize is that the refugee status is subject to foreign policy consideration and the political dynamics inside the country, while thinking of it as essentially as a open humanitarian consideration is not the case.
Alaikum. So you were talking about how there is this, basically this global hierarchy that has been perpetuating injustice and serving the elite at the cost of basically everyone else.
In both, elites in the global north and trained elites in the global south.
Absolutely, yeah. So when you're trying to think about change, usually you would imagine in an ideal sense that the responsibility falls on the people who have been perpetuating the injustice. But people in power, as we know, won't give up that power. So when we're talking about change, do you envision change as a responsibility of a grassroots effort of the people who are most vulnerable, or the people who are those middle managers? How does that work?
Well, again, you have to have a social movement that encompasses various strata of the society. You need the people who are affected at the grassroots. You need the middle manager. You need for them to actually depart. You need some parts of the elite to actually say that this is not working, it's not ethical, not moral. So you need to have a whole program that would actually make this transformation possible. So I would advocate that, again, there has to be a comprehensive vision to make that transformation. How, again, it's the $150 billion question for us to get to that point, but definitely it's a needed at this point more than yesterday.
Thank you very much. You spoke a bit about the economic and political motivations for colonialism, and I understand that there were also some religious motivations. Well, they might have been hiding behind religious motivations for colonialism.
Yeah.
Moving forward from colonialism, what can religion do to kind of ameliorate some of the evils that religion has had its name tied into in the past?
Yeah, again, religion there's many different types of religion, right? So there's imperial religion, which basically we see the notion of God and prophets coming on the top of a tank, right? And therefore, we have what you call the imperial religion. Today, we have success religion. God wants you to be rich. So in essence, there are aspects of religion that can give you the ability to give an interpretation and build a paradigm on that. Now, in the colonial period, definitely there was a very strong effort to convert, to Christianize various parts, but was the project itself vested in religion, or was it the economy? Then that was covered with the cloak of religion. I tend to find that religion is used and brought in to rationalize to the colonial citizens in the colonial motherland that their project is for a higher purpose. Because if you tell, in my sense, if it's a normal human being, you tell him, I want you to go with me to rob this person, most people, with the exception of you, we know who they are, will say, no, I don't. Maybe I could buy it from them, maybe I could talk, maybe we would cooperate. But if you tell the person that God wants you to do this, then it's a different issue. You begin to what you call work on a particular notion relative to religion, and you mobilize it in this way. And I think religion tends to be brought and rationalized without any exception. Again, this is not only Christianity, but religion itself can be a very crude and cruel instrument to mobilize power to actually cause damage and death and destruction for many people. For those of us, and I consider myself to be rooted in a religious ethos, that I always have to ask myself the question, is it moral, is it ethical, and is it the right thing to do for myself And if it is not right for myself to do, then I can't actually ask or inflict that on another human being. And I think that should be testing ourselves constantly in every encounter, and not to be what you call mobilized by what you call public discourse that tends to instrumentalize religion to get us into a mob type of response and begin to set aside our rational faculty. Religion and rationality has to be with us at all the time and not allow any type of mobilization on the base of religion that would violate the rights of other human beings. That, for me, is the core of religion.
I'm interested in your implicit vision of a utopia. So you mentioned local agriculture, right? So would you see maybe something like Israeli kibbutzes or California self-sufficient or intentional communities of having elements of a worthwhile or possible utopia?
I am like one of the furthest away from utopia, but I want to address certain problems. The further away the supply chain is, the more that somebody else is doing the work for you and you're living on their behalf. So for me, reducing that supply chain. So if you go to Whole Food, or it used to be Whole Wallet, but now Amazon have taken it, so they might reduce their prices, as they say. If you go to the shelf in there, and often I just stop to think, there's a pomegranate seeds that are peeled. And you flip the can in there, if you flip the plastic cover, it's actually processed in Egypt. So for me, I'm just like, it dawned on me, how would a person sitting in Egypt, whether it's in Alexandria or Cairo, possibly in a very hot, sweaty place, is sitting in there peeling their, what you call pomegranate, putting them in a container to be put on a ship or on DHL plane or whatever it is, to go across the Mediterranean, to go across the Atlantic, before Irma or after Irma, to land at one of the port cities in Newark or New York, to be shipped across by a train to the different distribution center of Whole Food, then for it to arrive at the shelf in the distribution center in the Bay Area, then to make it into the Whole Food on Telegraph, for me to walk in there and pick one for $3.75 and enjoy it because I don't want to, what you call, disturb my fingers. While if I go down the market, down the street, I have a farmer's market, I have people in there that have fresh pomegranate, and I know that the person picked it up in his or her hand, and therefore there are certain things that we could do that would actually change and alter their relationship. Doesn't mean you cannot eliminate totally and live in utopia until you get to paradise. But even at that time, they might ask you for a green card, and then you might be challenged to enter it. So it's not a utopian vision, but an actual understanding of what type of economic globalization that have taken place and how much abuse that is the modern economic structure, globalization, privatization, is producing to us. And what we need is to think morally and ethically and to ask ourselves that question.
And this will be the last question for the evening.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, this gentleman who's at the mic now.
Yes,
this
you want him
will
to?
be the last
okay,
question.
go ahead,
Yes,
the mic, and then we'll take.
Yeah, I think you might have touched on the answer right now, but I was curious, so over time the more we kind of look into like globalization and control and the elite, we come across a lot of different types of subject matters. I mean, some people are talking about, like, obviously, there's IMFs of the world, or there's the central bankers and how they're kind of keeping societies at bay from progressing by putting them in debt. And then you even hear crazy stuff like people putting chlorine to suppress the pineal gland or the third eye. I mean, there's all sorts of material out there.
Yeah.
What are some of the tactics, and I'm going to loosely use the word like the deep state here, but what are the key sort of objectives of the people really in control, and how are their own objectives kind of shifting as society goes by? And I know the alliances are also fairly loose.
Alliances, again, we need, I know it's a little bit difficult, but we need to have a democratic society that actually is democratic, that no longer is being purchased by massive amounts of money infused to campaigns. So I'm for public financing for campaigns. I'm against private financing that is basically making an election for the highest bidder. So we need to have that type. We could start it at the local level. We should actually ask and get the city of Berkeley, Oakland, and the other cities to actually put together initiatives at the local level that will empower and have locally funded campaign reforms, so you don't have some people that are pumping millions without name, without face into the political campaigns in this way. So there has to be that part of engagement at the local level. All politics is local, which means that the reversing and challenging has to take place at the local level. If you think you're going to take off on the mountain, you're going to immediately say it's too high to climb. But if you take it a step at a time and a small level engagement, my belief that this is how change can manifest, and then others can replicate and engage in this way. It's not a utopian. It's something that's doable. We see this, again, I remember writing some of the early platform for environmental movement during the early 1980s. And some of the things that we take for granted right now is actually part of our daily affairs in terms of the products that you have. ADA, American Disabilities, we worked on the ADA platform at the time and lobbied and worked on it, and we got an adoption of the American Disabilities Act. So there are certain things that could be movable and so on, but you have to think of it in, again, systematic and in a way that gets us into that point, rather than thinking, I need to move the mountain as a whole, then essentially you're not going to be able to do it, and most likely the mountain will move you in that sense. Harun, do you have another question?
That's it.
Okay. Thank you.
Note, we're going to end the program tonight. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Hatem Bazian, please.
Thank you.